Welcome. You have made it here to this quiet space at the end of your day. As you settle in, let your thoughts slow. Let the weight of the day begin to lift, little by little. Tonight, we're going to journey back to ancient Egypt, to the Nile Valley where summer heat climbed past 110 degrees. For the people who lived there, the desert sun was relentless. The air shimmered. The ground radiated heat long after sunset. In this environment, finding rest at night was not a simple matter. How did families sleep when the air itself felt like an oven? How did they find coolness in a land of endless heat? Their solutions were not dramatic. They were practical, developed over thousands of years. They relied on careful design, natural materials, and a deep understanding of how heat moves through earth and air. There was no single innovation. It was many small decisions working together. Over the next while, we will move through their world. We will see how they built their homes, how they prepared for the night, and how they found rest under the desert sky. So settle in. Let the story unfold at its own pace. The Nile Valley sits within a band of extreme dryness that stretches across North Africa. This region receives almost no rain. The sky is rarely clouded. The sun strikes the earth with full force from dawn until dusk. During the summer months, temperatures in Upper Egypt regularly climb to 43 degrees Celsius. In Fahrenheit, that is 110 degrees. On some days, the heat rose even higher. This was not the humid, heavy heat of tropical regions. The air in the Nile Valley was dry. Moisture evaporated quickly. The skin felt parched. Breathing itself could feel difficult in the middle of the afternoon. But the desert climate had another quality, one that shaped how people lived and slept. The lack of clouds and the low humidity meant that heat did not linger in the air after sunset. Once the sun dropped below the horizon, the temperature began to fall rapidly. By the middle of the night, the air could cool to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, just 4 degrees Celsius. This was a swing of more than 60 degrees between the heat of the afternoon and the chill of the late night. This extreme variation became the foundation of Egyptian life. The day was a time of endurance. The night was a time of recovery. Everything about how they built their homes, organized their routines, and prepared for sleep was shaped by this rhythm. The prevailing winds in the valley came from the northwest. These breezes travelled down the length of the Nile, flowing from the Mediterranean coast toward the interior deserts. The wind was steady, predictable. It was not strong, but it was constant. Egyptians understood this wind. They called it the breath of the north. It was cool, especially in the evening. It carried moisture from the distant sea. It provided relief. When you stood on a rooftop at dusk, you could feel this breeze moving over your skin. It was gentle, but after a day of scorching heat, it felt like a gift. This wind became central to how they designed their homes and planned their nights. The landscape itself offered resources. The Nile flooded every year, depositing rich silt across the floodplain. This silt was not just soil for farming, it was also clay, dense, heavy, and perfect for building. The river provided reeds and papyrus. The desert provided sand. Scattered groves of acacia and sycamore trees offered wood, though it was never abundant. Date palms lined the river, their fronds useful for weaving and construction. Everything the Egyptians needed to survive the heat was already present in the land around them. They did not import materials. They did not invent new substances. They simply learned to use what the valley provided, in ways that worked with the climate rather than against it. The challenge was clear. The heat of the day was punishing. The coolness of the night was brief, but essential. To sleep well, you had to protect yourself from the day's stored heat, while taking full advantage of the night's cooling air. The solution began with the walls. Every year the Nile rose. The inundation began in late summer, triggered by distant rains in the highlands of Ethiopia. The river swelled, overflowing its banks, spreading across the valley floor. This flood was not destructive. It was predictable, life-giving. The water brought silt. Fine particles of clay and sand carried hundreds of miles from the interior of Africa. When the flood receded, this silt remained, covering the fields in a layer of fresh, fertile earth. Farmers waited for the water to drain away, then planted their crops in the saturated soil. But before the planting began, there was another task. People gathered this silt, while it was still wet and pliable, and shaped it into bricks. This was not a casual decision. The silt from the Nile was not ordinary dirt. It had specific properties that made it ideal for construction in the Egyptian climate. The mixture of clay and sand gave the material both strength and workability. Pure clay would crack as it dried. Pure sand would not hold together. But the combination, in the proportions naturally delivered by the river, created a stable, durable substance. The silt was thick and heavy. When compacted, it had high thermal mass. It could absorb large amounts of heat without rapidly changing temperature. This quality would become the foundation of Egyptian cooling technology. The process of making bricks was simple but precise. Workers mixed the fresh silt with chopped straw, sometimes adding a small amount of animal manure. The straw was not just filler, it served a structural purpose. As the brick dried, it would naturally shrink. Without reinforcement, this shrinkage would cause cracks. The straw fibres distributed throughout the brick provided tensile strength, holding the structure together as it contracted. The fibres also increased the porosity of the brick, creating tiny air pockets that slightly reduced the material's ability to conduct heat. The manure, when included, acted as a binder. Its organic acids reacted with the clay, creating a more cohesive block. It also made the brick more resistant to moisture, which mattered during the rare but intense rainstorms that occasionally swept across the desert. Once mixed, the wet clay was pressed into rectangular wooden moulds. The moulds were open on top, allowing workers to smooth the surface with their hands. The bricks were then turned out onto the ground and left in the sun. Drying took time. A brick needed at least 30 days under the desert sun to cure properly. During this period, the water within the clay evaporated and the brick hardened. The final weight stabilized. The structure became solid. The Egyptians called this material DBT. We call it mudbrick or adobe. It was the primary building material for homes, workshops, storage buildings, and even sections of royal palaces. Stone was reserved for temples and tombs, structures meant to last forever. But for the living, mudbrick was the practical choice. This choice was not about cost or convenience alone. Mudbrick was superior to stone for one critical reason. It insulated against heat far more effectively. Stone, especially the limestone and sandstone available in Egypt, has high thermal conductivity. It absorbs heat quickly and releases it quickly. If you built a house from stone and left it in the sun all day, the interior would become unbearably hot. Even after sunset, the stone walls would radiate absorbed heat into the living space for hours. Mudbrick behaved differently. Its low thermal conductivity meant that heat moved through it very slowly. A thick mud brick wall absorbed the sun's energy during the day, but that energy took hours to penetrate to the inner surface. By the time it reached the interior, the outside air had already cooled. This phenomenon is called thermal lag. It is the delay between when heat enters a material and when it emerges on the other side. For the Egyptians, this delay was everything. It meant that the peak heat of the afternoon never reached the interior of the home, at the time when it mattered most. The walls of even modest Egyptian homes were often 2 feet thick, 60 centimetres. This thickness was not arbitrary. It was the minimum needed to achieve a thermal lag of 6 to 12 hours, depending on the density and moisture content of the brick. During the day, the outer surface of the wall might reach temperatures well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but the inner surface, shaded and insulated, remained far cooler, often 20 or 30 degrees lower. At night, the process reversed. The stored heat in the wall began to radiate outward, both into the cooler night air and into the interior rooms. But because the night air was so much cooler than the day, most of this energy dissipated harmlessly outside. The interior stayed at a relatively stable, comfortable temperature. This was not air conditioning. It was not mechanical cooling. It was simply the intelligent use of mass and time, turning the slow movement of heat through Earth into a passive climate control system. The bricks, once cured, were stacked and mortared together with more wet clay. The walls rose steadily, built by families or small groups of workers. There were no elaborate tools, just hands, wooden moulds, water, and the endless supply of silt that the Nile delivered every year. This cycle, flood, harvest, brick-making, construction, had been repeated for thousands of years by the time the pyramids were built. It continued for thousands more. The technology did not change because it did not need to change. It worked. The process of turning river silt into a finished brick was labour-intensive, but it followed a rhythm that fit naturally into the Egyptian agricultural calendar. After the flood receded, usually in late autumn, the fields were still too wet to plant. This was the ideal time to gather clay. Workers would dig into the fresh silt deposits, collecting the material in baskets and transporting it to a central work area. The clay was then spread out in a shallow pit, or on a hard packed surface. Water was added if the silt had begun to dry. Workers, often several people working together, would tread the mixture with their bare feet, kneading it until it reached a consistent, pliable texture. This treading was essential. It broke up clumps, distributed moisture evenly, and began the process of binding the clay particles together. It was exhausting work, done under the same sun that would later cure the bricks. Once the clay reached the right consistency, the chopped straw was added. The straw came from wheat or barley stalks, left over from the previous harvest. It was cut into short lengths, usually no more than a few inches long. The straw and clay were mixed together, again by treading. The goal was even distribution. Every part of the brick needed to contain fibres. Too much straw and the brick would be weak. Too little, and it would crack during drying. Some brickmakers added animal manure at this stage. The manure came from cattle, donkeys, or goats. It was dried and crumbled before being mixed in. The amount was small, just enough to enhance the binding properties without compromising the structural integrity. When the mixture was ready, it was carried to the moulding area. The moulds were simple wooden frames, open on top and bottom, usually sized to produce bricks about 30 centimetres long, 15 centimetres wide, and 10 centimetres thick. These dimensions were standardised across Egypt, allowing bricks from different sources to be used together in construction. A worker would press a lump of clay into the mould, packing it down firmly to eliminate air pockets. The top surface was smoothed with wet hands. Then the mould was lifted away, leaving the shaped brick on the ground. The bricks were laid out in rows, spaced apart to allow air to circulate. They were left in the sun to dry. This drying process could not be rushed. If a brick dried too quickly, the outer surface would harden while the interior remained wet, causing the brick to crack. If it dried too slowly, it might begin to decay or attract pests. The ideal drying time was 30 days, though this could vary depending on the temperature, humidity, and thickness of the brick. Workers learned to judge when a brick was fully cured by its weight and sound. A properly dried brick felt lighter, and when tapped, produced a clear, resonant tone. During the drying period, the bricks were monitored. If a rare rainstorm threatened, they were covered with mats or moved to sheltered areas. If the sun was too intense, they might be shaded to slow the drying and prevent cracking. Once cured, the bricks were hard and stable. They could be stacked, transported and stored without damage. A well-made mud brick could last for decades, even centuries, if protected from direct exposure to water. Construction began once enough bricks had accumulated. The foundation was usually a low platform of compacted earth or stone, raising the walls slightly above ground level to protect them from moisture during the rare floods or heavy rains. The bricks were laid in courses, with each brick slightly overlapping the one below, creating a strong bond. The mortar was simply more wet clay, often mixed with a bit of straw. This mortar was not as strong as the lime-based mortars used in stone construction, but it was sufficient for mud brick, which did not carry the enormous weight that stone structures did. Walls rose slowly, one course per day, or every few days, allowing the mortar to dry between layers. A typical home might take several weeks to build, depending on the size and the number of workers available. The thickness of the walls was determined by the building's purpose. Homes in the hottest regions of Upper Egypt had the thickest walls, sometimes as much as 70 centimetres. In cooler areas near the Mediterranean coast, walls could be thinner, around 40 centimetres. But thickness alone was not enough. The walls also needed protection. Bare mud brick exposed to the elements would gradually erode. Wind-blown sand would abrade the surface. Rare rains would dissolve the outer layers. Even the intense UV radiation of the desert sun could weaken the material over time. To protect the walls, they were covered with a thick coat of mud render. This was a mixture of clay and chopped straw, similar to the brick material but applied wet as a plaster. The render filled in gaps between bricks, smoothed the surface, and added an additional layer of insulation. Once the render had dried, it was coated with a lime wash. Lime was produced by heating limestone in kilns, then slaking the resulting quicklime with water. The lime wash was applied as a thin, milky liquid that soaked into the surface of the render and dried to a brilliant white. This white surface was not decorative, it was functional. White reflects solar radiation far more effectively than dark or earth-toned surfaces. By coating the exterior walls in white, the Egyptians reduced the amount of heat that the walls absorbed during the day by a significant margin. This technique, known as using a high albedo surface, could lower the surface temperature of a wall by 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit compared to an uncoated wall. That reduction translated directly into a cooler interior. The lime wash also protected the mud render from UV degradation and provided a barrier against wind erosion. It needed to be reapplied periodically, usually every few years, but the materials were readily available and the labour was minimal. The result was a structure that looked clean and bright, standing out against the brown and tan landscape of the desert. But more importantly, it was a structure that could resist the heat of the day and release it slowly at night, creating an interior environment that remained relatively stable and comfortable. This was the first line of defence against the desert sun. The walls were not just barriers, they were thermal batteries, storing and releasing energy in a rhythm that matched the diurnal cycle of the Egyptian climate. But walls alone were not enough. The Egyptians understood that to truly manage heat, they needed to control the movement of air. The physics of thermal lag are simple in principle, but powerful in practice. Heat does not move through solid materials instantly. It travels at a rate determined by the material's thermal conductivity, density and thickness. Mudbrick, with its low thermal conductivity and high density, is an exceptionally slow conductor of heat. When the sun strikes the outer surface of a mudbrick wall in the morning, that energy begins to penetrate the material, but it does so gradually. Imagine the wall as a series of layers, each one absorbing a portion of the incoming heat before passing the remainder deeper into the structure. The outer layer heats up first, warming the layer just beneath it, which in turn warms the next layer and so on. For a wall 60 centimetres thick, this process takes hours. The heat absorbed at 8 in the morning might not reach the interior surface until 8 in the evening. By that time, the sun has set. The exterior air is cooling. The worst of the day's heat has passed. This delay was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate design choices refined over thousands of years. Egyptians knew from experience that thicker walls stayed cooler inside. They knew that certain mixtures of clay and straw performed better than others. They knew that orientation mattered. Walls facing south absorbed more heat than those facing north. They did not have thermometers or thermal imaging cameras, but they did not need them. They had generations of observation, passed down through families and communities. They knew what worked. During the hottest part of the day, between noon and 3 in the afternoon, the interior of a well-built mudbrick home could be 20 to 30 degrees cooler than the outside air. This was not because the walls blocked the heat entirely. They did not. The heat was still being absorbed, but it was being absorbed slowly, and it would not reach the interior until later. This created a refuge. Families could retreat into the deepest rooms of their homes during the midday hours, escaping the direct assault of the sun. These rooms, surrounded on multiple sides by thick walls, remained the coolest spaces in the house. The floors, often packed earth or simple mud plaster, also contributed to this cooling effect. Like the walls, the floor had thermal mass. It absorbed heat from the air and from the feet of the people walking on it, but it released that heat slowly, maintaining a relatively constant temperature. In wealthier homes, floors might be paved with stone or brick, which provided a harder, more durable surface. But these materials, while cooler to the touch in the morning, could become uncomfortably warm by afternoon. Earth floors, though softer, remained more thermally stable throughout the day. The ceiling was another critical element. Most Egyptian homes had flat roofs, constructed from wooden beams overlaid with mats and packed mud. These roofs were thick, often as thick as the walls, providing additional thermal mass above the living space. During the day, the roof absorbed heat from the sun, but again, the thickness of the material meant that this heat took hours to penetrate. By the time it reached the underside of the roof, the ceiling of the room below the day's peak heat had passed. At night, the process reversed. The walls and roof, now warmer than the surrounding air, began to release their stored heat. Most of this heat radiated outward, into the cool night air. Some of it radiated inward, into the rooms of the house. This inward radiation was not a problem during the early evening, when the air inside the house was still warm from the day. But as the night progressed and the interior cooled, the slow release of heat from the walls and ceiling actually helped to prevent the rooms from becoming too cold. In the desert, nighttime temperatures could drop dramatically. In the winter, the air might fall below freezing. Even in summer, the late-night hours could feel uncomfortably cool after the intense heat of the day. The thermal mass of the mud brick walls acted as a buffer, smoothing out these extremes. This is why mud brick homes were comfortable year-round. In summer, they stayed cool during the day and released just enough warmth at night to prevent chill. In winter, they absorbed whatever heat was available, from the sun, from cooking fires, from the bodies of the people inside, and held onto that heat through the cold nights. The Egyptians did not think of their homes as passive structures. They understood them as dynamic systems, constantly interacting with the environment. The walls were not just barriers, they were participants in the daily cycle of heat and cold, absorbing and releasing energy in a rhythm that made life in the desert possible. This understanding extended to the placement and design of openings. Doors and windows were kept small and strategically located. Large openings would allow too much heat to enter during the day, or too much warmth to escape at night. Windows were often placed high on the walls near the ceiling. This took advantage of the fact that hot air rises. During the day, the hottest air in a room would collect near the ceiling. By placing a small window or vent at that level, the hot air could escape, drawing cooler air in through lower openings. This created a gentle, natural convection current within the room. It was not forceful. It did not cool the room rapidly, but it kept the air from becoming stagnant, and it helped to maintain a more comfortable temperature. Doors were often covered with thick curtains made of woven reeds or heavy linen. These curtains blocked the direct rays of the sun while still allowing air to pass through. They also provided privacy and protection from insects. The orientation of the house mattered as well. Whenever possible, Egyptians built their homes with the long axis running east to west. This minimized the amount of wall surface exposed to the intense southern sun. The southern wall, being smaller, absorbed less heat. The northern wall, shaded for much of the day, remained cooler. In densely packed urban areas, individual homes were built close together, often sharing walls. This reduced the surface area of each home exposed to the sun. A home surrounded on 3 sides by other homes had only one exterior wall facing the elements. The shared walls, insulated by the rooms on either side, remained at a moderate temperature. This communal approach to construction was not just practical, it was also efficient. Fewer exterior walls meant less material and labour required for each home. It also meant that the cooling effect of the mud brick was amplified, as the thermal mass of multiple homes worked together to stabilise the temperature of the entire neighbourhood. The Egyptians did not write treatises on thermodynamics. They did not produce architectural manuals explaining the principles of thermal mass and thermal lag. But they did not need to. Their knowledge was embedded in the way they built, in the materials they chose, in the thickness of their walls and the placement of their windows. It was knowledge born from necessity, refined through experience and passed down through generations. It was knowledge that worked. The outer surface of a mud brick wall, even when protected by a layer of mud render, remained vulnerable. The desert environment was harsh. Wind-blown sand acted as an abrasive, gradually wearing away the surface. The intense ultraviolet radiation of the sun broke down organic materials. Rare but violent rainstorms could dissolve unprotected mud, leaving deep gouges and channels in the walls. To protect the walls and to enhance their thermal performance, the Egyptians applied a final coating, a lime wash. Lime production was a simple but labour-intensive process. It began with limestone, which was abundant in the cliffs along the Nile Valley. Limestone is composed primarily of calcium carbonate. When heated to high temperatures in a kiln, the calcium carbonate decomposes, releasing carbon dioxide and leaving behind quicklime, calcium oxide. Quicklime is a caustic substance. It reacts violently with water, generating heat. This reaction, known as slaking, produces hydrated lime, or calcium hydroxide, which can be mixed with water to create a thin, milky liquid. This liquid, when applied to a porous surface like mud render, soaks into the material. As it dries, it reacts with carbon dioxide in the air, slowly converting back into calcium carbonate. This process, called carbonation, binds the lime to the surface, creating a hard, durable coating. Lime wash was not paint. It did not sit on top of the surface like a film. It penetrated the render, becoming part of the wall itself. This made it exceptionally long-lasting. A well-applied lime wash could endure for years without flaking or peeling. The most important property of lime wash, however, was its colour. When dry, lime wash is brilliant white. This white surface has a very high albedo, meaning it reflects a large percentage of the solar radiation that strikes it. Dark surfaces absorb most of the sunlight that hits them, converting that light energy into heat. A dark wall in full sun can become intensely hot, sometimes reaching temperatures above 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Light-coloured surfaces, by contrast, reflect much of that energy, preventing it from ever entering the wall. A whitewashed mud brick wall, under the same conditions as a dark wall, might remain 30 or 40 degrees cooler. This difference is significant. It means that the wall has less heat to manage, less energy to store and release. The entire thermal lag process becomes more effective because the starting point, the amount of heat entering the wall, is reduced. Egyptians applied lime wash in thin, even coats, using brushes made from bundled reeds or palm fibres. The liquid was watery, almost transparent when wet, but as it dried, the white colour emerged, growing brighter over the course of several hours. Multiple coats were often applied, each one adding to the thickness and durability of the finish. Between coats, the wall was allowed to dry completely, ensuring that each layer bonded properly. The lime wash was reapplied periodically, usually every few years. Over time, the surface would accumulate dust and dirt, reducing its reflectivity. A fresh coat restored the brilliant white and renewed the protective barrier. This maintenance was not burdensome. Lime was readily available. The application process was straightforward. A family could recoat their home in a matter of days, often doing the work themselves. The visual effect of an entire neighbourhood of whitewashed mud brick homes was striking. Against the brown and tan landscape of the desert, these bright structures stood out clean and luminous. But the brightness was not merely aesthetic. It was functional, a deliberate choice to maximise the reflection of solar energy and minimise heat absorption. Inside the home, the effect of the white exterior could be felt. The rooms remained noticeably cooler during the hottest part of the day. The difference might be only a few degrees, but in a climate where every degree mattered, those few degrees could mean the difference between comfort and distress. The lime wash also provided a secondary benefit. It acted as a barrier against moisture. Mud brick, being made from earth, is vulnerable to water. A prolonged rainstorm, though rare in Egypt, could soften and dissolve the surface of an unprotected wall. Lime, once carbonated, is much more water-resistant than mud. It sheds water rather than absorbing it. This meant that even during the occasional downpour, the walls remained structurally sound, with only minor surface erosion. In wealthier homes, the lime wash was sometimes tinted with natural pigments to create soft colours, pale yellows, light blues, or gentle ochres. These colours still reflected a significant amount of solar radiation, though not as much as pure white. The choice was often a balance between thermal performance and aesthetic preference. But for most homes, especially those of farmers, labourers and artisans, plain white was the standard. It was the most effective, the most practical, and the most economical choice. The combination of thick mud brick walls, protective mud render, and reflective lime wash created a building envelope that was remarkably efficient at managing heat. The walls absorbed solar energy slowly, delayed its transfer into the interior, and reflected a significant portion of it away before it ever had a chance to penetrate. This was the first layer of defence. But the Egyptians understood that walls alone could not provide complete comfort. Heat, no matter how slowly it moved, would eventually reach the interior. To maintain a livable environment, they needed a way to remove that heat, to flush it out of the house before it accumulated. They needed air movement, they needed ventilation. And for that, they turned to the wind. The prevailing winds of the Nile Valley came from the northwest, flowing down from the Mediterranean coast toward the interior of Egypt. These winds were not fierce, they did not howl or gust. They were steady, persistent, arriving with predictable regularity, especially in the evening hours. For the Egyptians, this wind was not merely a pleasant breeze. It was a resource as essential to daily life as water or grain. They called it the breath of the north, and they designed their homes to capture it. The device they created for this purpose was called the malkaf. In modern terms, it is known as a wind catcher. It was a specialised architectural feature, rising above the flat rooftops of Egyptian homes, designed to intercept the moving air and direct it downward into the living spaces below. The malkaf was typically a shaft, rectangular or triangular in cross-section, built from the same mud brick as the rest of the house. It extended several feet above the roof, with an opening on the side that faced northwest, the direction from which the prevailing winds came. The physics of the malkaf was straightforward. As the wind struck the northwest-facing opening, it created a zone of positive pressure at the entrance to the shaft. The moving air had nowhere to go but down. It flowed into the shaft and descended into the rooms below. At the same time, the warm air inside the house, being less dense than the cooler air from outside, naturally rose toward the ceiling. This warm air needed an escape route. High windows or vents, placed on the leeward side of the building, the side opposite the wind, allowed this warm air to exit. The result was a continuous flow of air through the house. Cool air entered through the malkaf, descended into the living spaces, absorbed heat from the interior, and then rose and exited through the high vents. This process is known as the stack effect, and it required no mechanical assistance. It was entirely passive, driven by the wind and by the natural buoyancy of warm air. The effectiveness of the malkaf depended on several factors. The height of the shaft mattered. A taller malkaf could capture wind at higher elevations, where the air moved faster and with fewer obstructions. The size of the opening mattered as well. Too small, and the airflow would be insufficient. Too large, and the shaft might admit too much hot air during the day, when the wind itself was warm. Egyptian builders learned to optimize these dimensions through trial and error. The most effective malkafs were those that were tall enough to rise above the roofline of neighbouring buildings, wide enough to admit a substantial volume of air, but not so large as to become structurally unstable or thermally inefficient. Archaeological evidence for the malkaf appears early in Egyptian history. Clay models of houses from the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, dating back more than 5,000 years, show clear rooftop scoops and shafts. These models were often placed in tombs, representing the homes that the deceased had known in life. By the New Kingdom, around 3,000 years ago, the malkaf had become a standard feature in high-status residences. Excavations at Amarna, the short-lived capital built by the pharaoh Akhenaten, reveal large villas with multiple malkafs, each one carefully oriented to capture the northwest breeze. One such villa belonged to Nakht, a high-ranking official. His estate featured large, open loggias, covered porches with columns on the north side of the house, designed to channel the breeze into the central rooms. Inside, ventilation shafts descended from the roof, distributing the cool air throughout the interior. The malkaf was not limited to elite homes. Smaller, simpler versions appear in the houses of artisans and labourers as well. These were less elaborate, often just a small rectangular opening in the roof with a short shaft descending into the main room. But the principle was the same: capture the wind, bring it inside, and use it to flush out the accumulated heat of the day. The timing of the Malkaf's effectiveness aligned perfectly with the needs of the inhabitants. During the day, when the sun was high and the heat was most intense, the wind itself was often warm. The Malkaf still provided ventilation, but the incoming air did not offer much cooling. However, as the sun set and the desert began to release its heat, the wind cooled rapidly. By the time evening arrived, the breeze entering through the Malkaf was noticeably cooler than the air inside the house. This was the moment when the Malkaf became most valuable. Families would gather in the rooms directly beneath the Malkaf during the early evening, feeling the cool air descend around them. It was a tangible relief, a physical sensation of the day's heat being pushed out and replaced by something fresher. The Malkaf also helped to prevent the build-up of stagnant air. In a sealed room, the air would become stale, heavy with the moisture from breathing and the odours of daily life. The constant, gentle circulation provided by the Malkaf kept the air fresh, reducing discomfort and making sleep easier. In some homes, particularly those of wealthier families, the Malkaf was combined with other features to enhance its effectiveness. Interior courtyards, open to the sky, allowed additional airflow and provided spaces where the family could sit in the evening, sheltered from the sun but exposed to the breeze. High ceilings in the main rooms allowed the warm air to rise well above the level where people sat or slept, creating a cooler zone near the floor. The Malkaf fed into these high spaces, ensuring that the cool air descended into the occupied areas rather than remaining near the ceiling. The construction of a Malkaf required skill. The shaft had to be aligned precisely with the direction of the prevailing wind. If it faced even slightly off axis, its efficiency would be reduced. The interior walls of the shaft had to be smooth to minimize friction and allow the air to flow freely. Some Malkafs were equipped with adjustable shutters or screens, allowing the inhabitants to control the amount of air entering the house. On particularly windy days, the shutters could be partially closed to prevent the interior from becoming too drafty. On calm days, they could be fully open to maximize airflow. The Malkaf represents a sophisticated understanding of atmospheric dynamics. The Egyptians did not have anemometers or wind tunnels, but they understood how wind behaved. They knew that it followed the contours of the land, that it accelerated over open water, that it cooled as the sun set. They also understood that wind was not just movement. It was a tool, a force that could be harnessed and directed. By building the Malkaf, they transformed an invisible, ephemeral phenomenon, moving air, into a reliable daily source of comfort. The Malkaf was not the only ventilation strategy. Homes were also designed with careful attention to the placement of doors and windows. Cross-ventilation, where air entered on one side of the building and exited on the other, was a common technique. Doors were often placed in alignment, creating a straight path for the breeze to follow. During the evening, these doors would be opened, allowing the wind to flow through the house unobstructed. At night, before sleep, some doors would be closed to prevent the house from becoming too cold, but the Malkaf would continue to provide gentle ventilation. The effectiveness of these ventilation strategies was enhanced by the thermal mass of the mudbrick walls. Because the walls released heat slowly, the incoming cool air was not immediately warmed by contact with the interior surfaces. Instead, the cool air could circulate through the rooms, absorbing heat from the air itself before rising and exiting. This created a dynamic equilibrium. The walls stored heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The Malkaf brought in cool air, which absorbed some of that released heat and carried it away. The result was an interior environment that remained comfortable far longer than would have been possible, with ventilation or thermal mass alone. The Malkaf was not a perfect solution. On calm days, when the wind did not blow, the system did not function. On days when the wind came from an unusual direction, the Malkaf might admit warm air rather than cool. But these days were rare. The prevailing winds of the Nile Valley were remarkably consistent, and the Egyptians built their homes to take full advantage of that consistency. The legacy of the Malkaf extends far beyond ancient Egypt. Similar wind-catcher designs appear in traditional architecture throughout the Middle East and North Africa, from Iran to Morocco. The principle, capturing the wind and using it to ventilate and cool buildings, remains valid in modern sustainable architecture. For the ancient Egyptians, the Malkaf was not just a technical innovation. It was a connection to the natural world, a way of inviting the breath of the north into their homes. It was a recognition that the desert, for all its harshness, also offered gifts: steady winds, cool nights, clear skies. The task was to design homes that could receive those gifts and transform them into comfort. The air that flowed through the Malkaf was dry, often carrying less than 10% relative humidity. This dryness was a defining characteristic of the desert climate. It made the heat feel less oppressive than humid heat, but it also created opportunities for cooling that would not have existed in a more humid environment. The key was evaporation. When liquid water transitions to water vapour, it absorbs a significant amount of energy from its surroundings. This energy, known as the latent heat of vaporization, is drawn from the air, from nearby surfaces, or from the water itself. The result is a drop in temperature. This is why sweating cools the human body. As perspiration evaporates from the skin, it removes heat, lowering the body's surface temperature. The same principle can be applied to cooling air or objects. The Egyptians understood this intuitively. They knew that a wet surface felt cooler than a dry one. They knew that water left in the sun would evaporate quickly, and that the remaining water would be cooler than the air around it. They applied this knowledge to their ventilation systems. One common technique was to place wet reed mats across the opening of the Malkaf. These mats were woven from papyrus or palm fronds, materials that absorbed and held water. The mats would be soaked in the Nile or in water drawn from a well, then positioned so that the incoming wind had to pass through them. As the dry air moved through the wet reeds, some of the water evaporated. This evaporation absorbed heat from the air, cooling it by several degrees. The cooled air then descended into the house, providing a more effective relief than the uncooled breeze alone. The mats needed to be re-wetted periodically as they dried out. This was typically done in the late afternoon, in preparation for the evening breeze. A servant or family member would carry water to the roof and pour it over the mats, ensuring they were saturated before the wind arrived. In some homes, particularly those of the wealthy, a more permanent solution was used. Porous clay jars, called zirs, were placed in the path of the airflow. These jars, which will be discussed in more detail shortly, allowed water to seep slowly through their walls, creating a continuously moist surface. As the wind passed over these jars, evaporation occurred constantly. The air was cooled, and the water inside the jars was also cooled by the same process. This created a dual benefit: cooler air for ventilation and cooler water for drinking. The effectiveness of evaporative cooling depends on the humidity of the air. In very humid environments, the air is already saturated with moisture, and little additional evaporation can occur. But in the dry air of the Nile Valley, evaporation happened rapidly and continuously. The temperature drop achieved through evaporative cooling in the Egyptian climate could be substantial. On a day when the outside air was 110 degrees, passing that air through a wet mat could reduce it to 100 degrees or even lower. This 10-degree reduction, while modest, was enough to make a noticeable difference in comfort. The technique was not limited to the Malkaf. Wet mats were also hung over windows and doorways, serving the same purpose. As the breeze passed through these openings, it was cooled before entering the living spaces. These mats had an additional benefit. They filtered the air, trapping dust and sand particles that would otherwise blow into the house. In the desert, where sandstorms and dust devils were common, this filtering function was valuable. The Egyptians did not have the concept of relative humidity or latent heat, but they understood the observable effects. They knew that evaporation cooled things. They knew that dry air allowed more evaporation. They knew that wet surfaces, when exposed to moving air, provided relief from heat. This knowledge was not written in technical manuals. It was embedded in practice, in the daily routines of preparing for the evening, in the techniques passed from parents to children. It was knowledge that worked consistently and reliably, year after year. The combination of the Malkaf and evaporative cooling represented a layered approach to climate control. The Malkaf provided the airflow. The wet mats or jars provided the cooling. Together they transformed the hot desert breeze into something far more comfortable. This layering extended to other aspects of the home as well. The thick mud brick walls provided thermal mass. The white lime wash provided solar reflection. The malcaf provided ventilation. The evaporative cooling provided temperature reduction. Each element contributed to the overall system, and each element was necessary. Remove any one element, and the system would still function, but less effectively. A home without a malcaf would still benefit from thermal mass, but it would be stuffier and less comfortable. A home without evaporative cooling would still have ventilation, but the incoming air would be warmer. It was the integration of these elements, the way they worked together, that made Egyptian homes livable in such extreme heat. This integration was not the result of a single genius or a grand plan. It was the result of incremental improvements, small adjustments made over generations, each one tested and refined until it became standard practice. The Egyptians also understood that cooling was not just about lowering temperature. It was about creating comfort, and comfort involved more than just the air temperature. It involved humidity, airflow, radiant heat, and even psychological factors. A room with a breeze feels cooler than a still room at the same temperature. A room with lower humidity feels more comfortable than a humid room. A room where the walls are cool to the touch feels different from a room where the walls radiate heat. The Egyptian approach to cooling addressed all of these factors. The malcaf provided airflow. The evaporative cooling reduced both temperature and the perception of heat. The thick walls minimized radiant heat. The result was a space that felt comfortable, even when the thermometer might suggest otherwise. This holistic understanding of comfort is something that modern air conditioning often fails to replicate. Mechanical cooling systems can lower the temperature effectively, but they often create still, humid environments that feel clammy and unpleasant. They remove heat, but they do not create the sensation of freshness that moving air provides. The Egyptian system, by contrast, created an environment that felt natural. The air moved. It carried the scent of the river, of palm trees, of the desert. It varied slightly in temperature and humidity, creating a dynamic rather than static experience. This variability was not a flaw. It was a feature. It connected the inhabitants to the world outside, to the rhythms of the day and the movement of the wind. It reminded them that they were not isolated from nature, but living within it, sheltered, but not separated. As evening deepened and the wind continued to blow, the house would gradually cool. The hottest air, trapped near the ceiling during the day, would be pushed out through the high vents. The cooler air from the malcaf would settle into the lower levels, filling the rooms where people sat and prepared for sleep. This process did not happen instantly. It took time, sometimes an hour or more, for the full effect to be felt. But that gradual transition was part of the daily rhythm, a signal that the day was ending and the night was beginning. Families would move through their routines, eating the evening meal, tending to animals, preparing bedding, while the house around them slowly transformed from a heat reservoir into a cool refuge. By the time they were ready to sleep, the interior would be noticeably more comfortable than it had been at sunset. The malcaf would continue to function through the night, though the wind often diminished in the early morning hours. Even with reduced airflow, the ventilation was sufficient to prevent the air from becoming stale or uncomfortably warm. This was the second layer of defense against the heat. The walls managed the thermal load. The malcaf and evaporative cooling managed the air. Together they created conditions where sleep was possible, even in the midst of one of the hottest climates on Earth. Water was precious in the desert. It was also versatile. Beyond its role in agriculture and drinking, water served as a tool for managing heat, both in the air and in the objects people used daily. The Egyptians developed a specific type of ceramic vessel designed to keep water cool through the same principle of evaporative cooling that was used in the malcaf. These vessels were made from a particular type of clay, known as marl clay, which remained slightly porous even after firing. The most common of these vessels was the zir, a large storage jar that could hold several gallons of water. The zir was used in households, workshops, and public spaces, providing a communal source of drinking water that remained refreshingly cool even in the heat of the day. The swallow was a smaller version, designed for personal use. It was shaped like a narrow-necked bottle, easy to carry and to drink from directly. Many households had several cullis, one for each member of the family. The cooling mechanism was simple but effective. The walls of the zir, or cullis, being porous, allowed a small amount of water to seep from the interior to the outer surface. In the dry desert air, this moisture evaporated almost immediately. The evaporation absorbed heat from the water remaining inside the vessel, lowering its temperature. The effect was continuous. As long as there was water in the vessel and the air remained dry, the cooling process continued. The temperature drop achieved by this method was significant. Water stored in a zir could be 15 to 20 degrees cooler than the ambient air. On a day when the air temperature was 110 degrees, the water inside the zir might be 90 degrees or even lower. This was not as cold as modern refrigeration, but it was far cooler than water left in a sealed, non-porous container. The difference was immediately noticeable when drinking. The water felt refreshing, almost shocking against the heat of the throat and mouth. The zir and kullah were typically placed in shaded, breezy locations to maximize evaporation. A common spot was beneath the malkaf, where the moving air constantly removed the moisture from the outer surface of the vessel, allowing more water to seep out and evaporate. Some households kept their zirs on the rooftop where the wind was strongest. Others placed them in the central room, where they would be easily accessible, but still benefit from the airflow provided by the malkaf and the high windows. The vessels were often covered with a loose lid or a piece of cloth to keep out dust and insects. This covering did not seal the vessel. Air still circulated around the outer surface, allowing evaporation to continue. The production of zirs and kullas required skill. The clay had to be prepared carefully, with just the right amount of temper, usually fine sand or crushed shell, to create the desired porosity. Too little temper and the vessel would be too dense, preventing water from seeping through. Too much, and the vessel would be too weak, prone to cracking or leaking excessively. The firing temperature also mattered. A zir fired at too high a temperature would vitrify, becoming glassy and non-porous. A zir fired at too low a temperature would remain soft and fragile. Potters learned through experience to judge the correct firing time and temperature, producing vessels that were both durable and functional. The outer surface of the zir was sometimes left unglazed and undecorated, allowing maximum evaporation. In other cases, decorative patterns were incised or painted on the upper portion, while the lower portion, where evaporation was most important, remained plain. The zir was not just a container, it was a household appliance, performing a function that would later be achieved by mechanical refrigerators. It required no energy beyond the natural evaporation driven by the dry air. It required no maintenance beyond occasional cleaning. A well-made zir could last for years, even decades, serving generation after generation. When a zir cracked or broke, the pieces were often recycled, ground up and mixed into the clay for new vessels. The Egyptians also developed a more advanced application of the evaporative cooling principle, known as the pot-in-pot method. This technique was used primarily for storing perishable foods and medicines rather than water. The pot-in-pot system consisted of two ceramic vessels, one smaller than the other. The smaller pot was placed inside the larger one, and the gap between them was filled with wet sand. The outer pot was porous, allowing moisture from the sand to evaporate through its walls. As the moisture evaporated, it cooled both the sand and the inner pot. The inner pot, being surrounded by this cool, damp sand, remained significantly cooler than the ambient air. The temperature inside the inner pot could drop to levels low enough to slow the spoilage of food. Vegetables, fruits, and even certain meats could be stored in the inner pot for several days without spoiling, a remarkable achievement in a climate where food degradation normally occurred within hours. This extended the usability of fresh foods, reducing waste and improving nutrition. The sand between the pots needed to be kept moist. This was typically done by pouring water over the sand once or twice a day. The water soaked into the sand, and the evaporation process began anew. The pot-in-pot method was more labour-intensive than simply using a zir for water storage, but the benefits were substantial. It allowed families to preserve food harvested from their gardens or purchased at the market, stretching their resources and providing variety in their diet. The principle behind both the zir and the pot-in-pot system is the same, using the phase change of water from liquid to vapour to remove heat from a system. This is one of the most efficient forms of passive cooling available, requiring only water, porous materials, and dry air. The Egyptians did not invent this principle. Evaporative cooling is a natural phenomenon, observable in the way a wet cloth feels cool in the wind or the way a shallow pool of water cools as it evaporates. But the Egyptians systematized it, creating purpose-built tools that made the principle reliable and useful. The zir and qulla were ubiquitous in Egyptian life. They appear in tomb paintings, showing servants pouring water from zirs into cups for their masters. They appear in archaeological excavations, their distinctive shapes immediately recognizable, even when broken into fragments. They were not luxury items. They were everyday objects used by people of all social classes. A farmer's home might have a single, simple zir. A wealthy villa might have dozens, placed throughout the house and garden. But the principle was the same, and the benefit was the same. The psychological impact of having access to cool water should not be underestimated. In extreme heat, dehydration is a constant threat. The body loses moisture through perspiration, breathing, and other processes. Without adequate hydration, physical and mental performance deteriorate rapidly. Cool water was not just more pleasant to drink, it was easier to drink in sufficient quantities. Warm water, while still hydrating, is less appealing, and people tend to drink less of it. Cool water encouraged hydration, helping to maintain health and comfort. At night, a qulla placed near the bedside ensured that a sleeper who woke thirsty could drink without having to leave their sleeping mat or bed. This was particularly important in the dry desert air, where the mouth and throat could become parched during sleep. The zir and qulla represent another layer in the Egyptian system of heat management. Like the mudbrick walls and the malkaf, they were simple in concept but powerful in effect. They used abundant local materials, clay, water and air, to solve a fundamental problem of desert life. They also exemplify the Egyptian ethos of working with the environment rather than against it. Instead of trying to force water to stay cold through insulation or mechanical cooling, the Egyptians allowed water to interact with the dry air, using that interaction to achieve the desired result. This approach, observing natural processes, understanding their mechanisms, and designing tools that harness those processes, was central to Egyptian ingenuity. It was not about dominating nature. It was about learning from nature and finding ways to live comfortably within its constraints. By late afternoon, the thick mud-brick walls had absorbed hours of solar radiation. The heat, delayed by the thermal mass of the material, had been gradually working its way through the bricks layer by layer. As evening approached, this stored heat began to reach the interior surfaces of the walls. The coolest rooms, those that had been refuges during the midday heat, started to warm. The air inside the house, which had been sheltered and comfortable, began to feel stuffy. This was the moment when the thermal lag, which had protected the inhabitants all day, began to work against them. The walls, now warmer than the air outside, started to radiate heat inward. The rooms that had been sanctuaries became less comfortable. The Egyptians did not fight this process. They did not try to insulate the interior or block the heat from entering. Instead, they simply moved. They left the interior rooms and migrated to a different part of their home. This migration was not a dramatic event. It was a routine transition, as natural as the setting of the sun. Families understood that the house had different zones, each one suited to different times of the day. During the midday hours, the deepest interior rooms, those surrounded by thick walls on multiple sides, were the coolest. These rooms, often used for storage or as sleeping quarters during the hottest months, provided shelter when the sun was at its peak. In the early evening, as these rooms began to warm, the family would move to the outer rooms, those with windows or openings to the north. Here, they could feel the breeze from the malkaf and the cooling effect of the evaporative systems. But by the time the sun had fully set, even these outer rooms might retain too much of the day's heat. The walls, though cooling, were still warmer than the night air. The solution was to leave the enclosed spaces entirely. The Egyptians climbed the stairs to the roof. The rooftop was not an afterthought in Egyptian architecture. It was an integral part of the living space, designed and maintained with as much care as any interior room. For many families, the rooftop was where they spent the majority of their evenings and nights, especially during the hot summer months. The transition from interior to rooftop was a daily migration. a movement from one climate zone to another within the same structure. It was a way of living with the heat rather than resisting it, of using the different thermal properties of different spaces at different times. This pattern of movement, from deep interior at midday to outer rooms in the afternoon to rooftop at night, created a rhythm to the day that was shaped by the environment. People did not stay in one place. They moved with the heat, always seeking the most comfortable available space. This mobility was possible because Egyptian homes were designed for it. Rooms were not filled with heavy furniture that would be difficult to move. Sleeping surfaces were portable, mats that could be rolled up and carried, or lightweight bed frames that could be disassembled. Cooking was often done outdoors or in semi-enclosed courtyards, so the kitchen did not tie the family to a specific location. Storage was in jars and baskets that could be accessed from multiple rooms, or even from the rooftop if needed. The staircase that led to the roof was an essential feature. It was usually located at the rear of the house, built from the same mud brick as the walls. The stairs were wide enough to carry mats, bedding and other necessities, but steep enough to minimise the space they occupied. In some homes the staircase was enclosed, protecting it from the weather and making it easier to climb during sandstorms or rain. In others, it was open, allowing the breeze to flow through. The rooftop itself was carefully constructed. It had to be strong enough to support the weight of multiple people, along with their bedding and belongings. It had to be smooth enough to be comfortable, but not so smooth that it became slippery. The base of the roof was a framework of wooden beams, usually acacia or sycamore, laid across the top of the walls. These beams were spaced closely, often no more than a foot apart, to provide adequate support. Over the beams, layers of woven palm fibre mats or reeds were laid. These mats distributed the weight and provided a surface for the next layer, which was a thick coating of mud plaster. This plaster was mixed with straw, similar to the mud brick material, and applied in multiple coats until it formed a solid, level surface. The finished roof was typically 6 to 8 inches thick, providing both structural strength and additional thermal mass. During the day, the roof absorbed heat just like the walls, but because it was exposed to the sky on the upper surface and to the house on the lower surface, it could radiate heat in both directions. At night, the upper surface of the roof cooled rapidly, radiating heat toward the clear, dark sky. This process, known as radiative cooling, is highly effective in dry climates with clear skies. The roof could become several degrees cooler than the air temperature, creating a surprisingly comfortable surface. The rooftop was not a bare, featureless expanse. Many homes had low walls around the perimeter, providing privacy and preventing people from accidentally rolling off the edge during sleep. These walls were usually only a foot or two high, just enough to provide a sense of enclosure without blocking the breeze. Wealthier homes often had additional structures on the roof. Small wooden loggias, open on the sides but covered on top, provided shade in the early morning and protection from the dew that occasionally formed before dawn. These loggias were light, airy structures, not meant to block the wind but to provide a defined space within the larger rooftop area. Some rooftops had storage areas for grain or other goods, taking advantage of the dry, well-ventilated environment. Others had small gardens, with pots of herbs or flowers that could survive in shallow soil and limited water. The rooftop was also a social space. Neighbours living in closely packed houses could see and talk to each other from their respective roofs. Evenings on the rooftop were a time for conversation, for watching the stars, for simply enjoying the coolness after the heat of the day. Children played on the rooftops, running from house to house, in neighbourhoods where the homes were built so close together that the roofs formed a continuous surface. Parents kept watch from a distance, able to see their children while still attending to their own tasks. The act of moving to the rooftop was a signal. It meant the day was ending. It meant the heat was receding. It meant rest was approaching. Families carried their sleeping mats or bed frames up the stairs, along with light linen sheets, headrests, and sometimes a small jar of water. The process took only a few minutes, but it was a ritual, a transition from the enclosed, heated interior to the open, cooling expanse of the roof. Once on the roof, they would lay out their bedding, positioning it to catch the breeze from the northwest. Some preferred to sleep near the centre of the roof, away from the walls. Others preferred a spot near the edge, where they could look out over the city or the fields. The rooftop offered something the interior rooms could not: direct exposure to the night sky. The sky in Egypt, far from modern light pollution, was filled with stars. The Milky Way stretched overhead, a river of light. The constellations, familiar and unchanging, moved slowly across the dome of the heavens. This visual connection to the cosmos was not merely aesthetic. It was part of the Egyptian understanding of the world, a reminder that the rhythms of human life were connected to larger cycles. The movement of the stars, the flooding of the Nile, the rising and setting of the sun. Sleeping under the open sky also meant exposure to the elements. There was no roof to block the wind, no walls to trap the heat. The air moved freely, carrying away the warmth of the day and replacing it with the coolness of the night. This was the third layer of the Egyptian cooling system. The walls managed heat through thermal mass. The Malkaf managed air through ventilation. The rooftop managed comfort through direct exposure to the night, to the wind, and to the radiative cooling of the open sky. The staircase was more than a functional element. It was a threshold, a passage from one mode of living to another. During the day, it was rarely used, but as evening approached, it became one of the most important features of the house. The construction of the staircase required care. It had to be strong, stable, and safe, even in the dark. Most staircases were built from mudbrick, the same material as the walls, but they were reinforced with wooden beams or stone slabs to prevent sagging or collapse. The steps themselves were relatively steep by modern standards. Space was limited, and a gradual incline would have consumed too much area. The treads were wide enough for a foot, and the risers were low enough to climb comfortably, even while carrying bedding or small children. In larger homes, the staircase might be enclosed within a narrow shaft, with walls on both sides. This provided protection from the elements and structural support. In smaller homes, the staircase might be external, attached to the outside of the house, saving interior space. Some staircases were straight, rising directly from the ground floor to the roof. Others were L-shaped or even spiral, turning at a landing partway up. The design depended on the layout of the house and the available space. The staircase often opened onto a small landing at the rooftop level, providing a safe area to step out onto the roof. This landing might be slightly raised, creating a transition between the stairwell and the open expanse of the roof. Climbing the stairs in the evening became a ritual. It marked the end of the day's work and the beginning of the night's rest. The act of ascending, of moving upward toward the sky, had a symbolic dimension as well. It was a movement from the earthbound world of labour and heat to the celestial world of stars and coolness. As families climbed, they carried everything they would need for the night. Sleeping mats were rolled and tucked under one arm. Linen sheets were folded and draped over a shoulder. Headrests, often carved from wood, were carried in hand. Small jars of water, sealed with linen or pottery lids, were brought along to prevent thirst during the night. In households with servants, the servants might carry these items, making multiple trips up and down the stairs. In smaller households, each person carried their own bedding, even the children, who learned from an early age to transport their mats and headrests. The rooftop, when reached, often revealed a scene already in progress. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. The air was beginning to cool, though the heat of the day still lingered. The breeze from the northwest was picking up, more noticeable now than it had been during the afternoon. From the rooftop, the world looked different. The streets below were visible but distant. The sounds of the city, voices, animals, the occasional cart, rose up but were muted by distance. The perspective shifted from the intimate enclosed spaces of the interior rooms to the wide open expanse of the sky and the land. In urban areas, rooftops were densely packed. Neighbours could see each other, wave, call greetings. In some neighbourhoods, the rooftops were so close that a person could step from one to another, creating a network of elevated pathways. In rural areas, rooftops offered views of the fields, the river, the distant desert. The horizon stretched far, unbroken by walls or buildings. The sense of space was immense, a reminder of the larger landscape within which the small mud-brick house existed. The rooftop was not silent. The wind rustled through the palm trees. Birds, settling in for the night, called to each other. The river, if nearby, produced a low, constant murmur. These sounds were part of the nighttime soundscape, familiar and reassuring. As the sun set, the temperature began to drop more rapidly. The air, which had been hot and dry all day, took on a different quality. It became softer, gentler. The light changed, shifting from harsh white to warm gold, then to deep orange and red, before fading into the blue-grey of dusk. This was the time to arrange the bedding. Sleeping mats, woven from reeds or palm fibre, were unrolled and spread on the surface of the roof. These mats were light but durable, providing a thin barrier between the sleeper and the roof. They were cool to the touch, even after a day of heat, because the reeds did not retain warmth the way fabric would. For those with more resources, a wooden bed frame was carried to the rooftop and assembled. These frames were usually designed to be portable, with legs that could be removed or folded. The sleeping surface was a network of woven linen cords or leather strips, stretched tight across the frame. The bed was positioned to face the northwest, allowing the breeze to flow directly over the sleeper. The elevation of the bed, several feet off the roof surface, placed the sleeper in the path of the strongest wind, and reduced contact with the radiant heat that the roof might still be releasing. Linen sheets were laid over the mat or the bed. These sheets were the same material used for clothing, light, breathable, capable of wicking moisture. They provided a clean surface to lie on, and a layer that could be adjusted as the temperature changed during the night. The headrest, carved from wood or moulded from clay, was placed at the head of the sleeping area. This object, which will be discussed in detail later, was an essential part of the sleeping arrangement, designed to support the head while allowing air to circulate around the neck and face. As the preparations continued, the sky darkened. The first stars appeared, faint at first, then growing brighter as the last light of the sun faded. The Egyptians knew these stars well. They had names for the constellations, stories about their origins, and practical uses for their positions. The stars were not just decorative. They were a clock, a calendar, a guide. Certain stars rose at certain times of the year, marking the approach of the flood or the beginning of the harvest. Certain stars crossed the meridian at certain hours, indicating the progress of the night. This connection to the sky was intimate and constant. There were no electric lights to obscure the stars, no artificial illumination to compete with the heavens. The night sky was fully visible, in all its depth and complexity. Sleeping under such a sky created a sense of scale, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the smallness of human concerns. It also created a sense of continuity, a connection to all the people who had slept under the same stars in the past and all who would sleep under them in the future. The rooftop was not just a place to escape the heat. It was a place to reconnect with the natural world, to feel the wind, to see the stars, to hear the sounds of the night. It was a place where the boundary between human space and natural space became permeable, where the house opened up to the desert and the sky. This openness was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it allowed for maximum cooling, maximum ventilation, maximum comfort. Symbolically, it represented a way of living that was not separate from the environment, but integrated with it. The Egyptians did not see themselves as conquering the desert or mastering the heat. They saw themselves as living within a landscape that had its own rhythms and demands. The rooftop was an expression of that understanding, a space that was neither fully inside nor fully outside, but somewhere in between. The rooftop offered a form of exposure that interior rooms could never provide. There were no walls to block the wind, no ceiling to trap the rising heat. The air moved freely, unobstructed, flowing across the surface of the roof and over the bodies of those who lay there. This exposure was the point. The entire purpose of moving to the rooftop was to place oneself directly in contact with the cooling elements of the night, the wind, the radiative cooling toward the sky, the dropping temperature of the desert air. The breath of the north wind was most tangible here. On the rooftop, even a gentle breeze became noticeable. It moved across the skin, evaporating perspiration, carrying away the accumulated heat of the day. It was not a strong wind, not the kind that would disturb bedding or make sleep difficult. It was steady, persistent, cooling. The direction of the wind mattered. The prevailing northwest breeze came from the Mediterranean, carrying with it a hint of moisture and a slightly lower temperature than the air that had spent the day over the desert. Families positioned their sleeping areas to face this wind, lying with their heads to the northwest so that the breeze flowed over their entire bodies. In wealthier households, small wooden structures provided a degree of shelter without blocking the wind entirely. These loggias were simple frames, often just 4 posts supporting a flat roof of palm fronds or woven mats. The sides were open, allowing the breeze to pass through. The loggia provided shade in the early morning, when the sun rose and began to heat the rooftop again. It also offered a psychological sense of enclosure, a defined space within the larger expanse of the roof. Some people found this comforting, a way to feel protected without sacrificing the cooling benefits of sleeping outdoors. The loggia might be equipped with light curtains hung from the roof beams. These curtains were made of linen or woven reeds, translucent rather than opaque. They could be drawn for privacy or left open for maximum airflow. They moved gently in the breeze, their motion creating a sense of calm. But many people slept without any overhead structure, preferring the completely open sky. This allowed for maximum radiative cooling, the process by which a surface loses heat by emitting infrared radiation toward the sky. On a clear night, the sky acts as an enormous heat sink. A surface on the ground or on a rooftop radiates energy upward, and that energy escapes into the vastness of space. This process is most effective when the sky is clear, when there are no clouds to reflect the radiation back down. In the desert, clouds were rare. The sky was almost always clear, providing ideal conditions for radiative cooling. The surface of the rooftop, which had been warm from the day's absorbed heat, began to cool rapidly once the sun set. By the middle of the night, the roof surface could be noticeably cooler than the air temperature. This created a comfortable sleeping environment. The sleeper was not lying on a hot surface, but on one that was actively cooling. The mat or bed frame provided a slight separation, allowing air to circulate beneath the body, preventing heat from accumulating. The psychological effect of sleeping under the open sky should not be underestimated. For people who spent their days in enclosed spaces, under roofs, surrounded by walls, the rooftop represented freedom. It was a space without boundaries, where the horizon was visible, where the stars stretched overhead in an unbroken dome. The stars themselves were part of the experience. The Egyptians recognized patterns in the stars, groupings that we would call constellations. They had names for these patterns, and they knew their movements across the sky. The stars were not static. They rose in the east and set in the west, just as the sun did. But each star rose at a slightly different time each night. Over the course of weeks and months, different stars became visible at different times, creating a celestial calendar. The Egyptians divided the sky into 36 sections, each one associated with a group of stars called a decan. These decans rose sequentially, one every 10 days throughout the year. By observing which decan was rising on the eastern horizon, an astronomer or priest could determine the time of year with considerable accuracy. But the decans also served a more immediate purpose. They marked the hours of the night. As each decan rose, crossed the meridian, and set, it indicated the passage of time. This was the Egyptian star clock, a timekeeping system that required no instruments, only knowledge and observation. For someone lying on a rooftop watching the stars, the passage of the night became visible. The constellations shifted. Certain stars moved across the sky. The position of the Milky Way changed. This slow, stately progression was both beautiful and informative. The brightest star in the Egyptian sky was Sirius, which they called Sopdet. This star had special significance because its heliacal rising, its first appearance on the eastern horizon just before dawn, after a period of invisibility, coincided with the beginning of the Nile's annual flood. The appearance of Sopdet marked the new year in the Egyptian calendar. It was an event of cosmic importance, linking the movement of the stars to the life-giving rhythm of the river. For someone sleeping on a rooftop in the weeks leading up to the flood, the anticipation of seeing Sopdet rise would have been palpable. The stars were not just markers of time, they were also navigational aids, guides for travellers crossing the desert at night. The North Star, though not as prominent in the ancient sky as it is today due to the precession of the equinoxes, was still a reference point for determining direction. The constellation we call Orion, which the Egyptians associated with Osiris, the god of the afterlife, was visible for much of the year. Its distinctive belt of 3 stars was easily recognizable, and its position could be used to orient oneself even in the darkest night. The moon, when present, added its own light to the rooftop. A full moon could illuminate the entire landscape, casting shadows, turning the desert silver. A crescent moon provided less light but was still visible, a delicate arc in the sky. The phases of the moon marked another calendar, one that governed religious festivals and certain agricultural activities. The Egyptians did not use a purely lunar calendar, but they were aware of the moon's cycles and incorporated them into their understanding of time. Sleeping under the moon and stars created a connection to these larger cycles. It was a reminder that the individual life, with its daily concerns and routines, was part of something much larger, a cosmic order that the Egyptians called Ma'at. Ma'at was a complex concept, encompassing truth, justice, balance, and cosmic harmony. It was the principle that governed the movement of the stars, the flooding of the Nile, the rising and setting of the sun. It was also the principle that should govern human behaviour, ensuring that society functioned smoothly and that individuals lived in accordance with natural law. Sleeping under the open sky, surrounded by the evidence of Ma'at, the orderly progression of the stars, the predictable rhythm of the night, was itself a form of participation in this cosmic order. It was a way of aligning one's life with the larger patterns of the universe. The rooftop was also a place of sound. The desert night was not silent. The wind produced a constant low murmur as it moved through palm fronds and over the surface of the roof. This sound was steady, unchanging, a form of natural white noise that could mask other, less regular sounds. From the river, if the house was near enough, came the sounds of water, the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, the splash of a fish breaking the surface, the calls of waterfowl settling in for the night. Hippos, common in the Nile during ancient times, were particularly vocal at night. Their deep rumbling calls carried for miles, a sound that was both familiar and slightly unsettling. The Egyptians knew these animals well, respected their power, and understood that their presence in the river was a sign of a healthy ecosystem. Birds called to each other as darkness fell. The African fish eagle, with its distinctive haunting cry, was one of the most recognizable voices of the Egyptian night. Other birds, herons, ibises, ducks, added their own calls, creating a layered soundscape. Insects contributed as well. Crickets and cicadas produced their rhythmic chirping, a sound that rose and fell in waves. These sounds were so constant, so much a part of the nighttime environment, that they became almost unnoticeable, fading into the background. Occasionally, the sound of human activity would rise from the streets below. Voices in conversation, the barking of a dog, the braying of a donkey. These sounds were part of the fabric of community life, reminders that the rooftop sleeper was not isolated but part of a larger social world. The combination of these sounds, wind, water, animals, insects, distant human voices, created an acoustic environment that was rich and complex. It was not the silence of a sealed, air-conditioned room. It was the living sound of a world that continued its activities even as people slept. This soundscape had a rhythmic quality. The wind was constant. The water sounds were regular. The animal calls followed patterns. Even the insect noises had a cadence. This rhythm may have had a soporific effect, lulling the listener into a state of relaxation. The rooftop sleeping experience was multi-sensory. There was the physical sensation of the cooling breeze, the visual spectacle of the stars, the auditory landscape of the night sounds. There was also the smell of the desert, dry earth, the faint scent of the river, sometimes the fragrance of flowers or herbs growing in nearby gardens. All of these elements combined to create an environment that was conducive to rest. It was not the controlled, isolated environment of modern sleep, but something more integrated with the natural world, more connected to the larger rhythms of the landscape and the cosmos. The headrest was unlike anything used for sleep in most modern cultures. It was not soft. It was not designed to cradle the head in the way a pillow does. Instead, it elevated the head, supporting it at a specific height and angle, while leaving the neck and the area around the head completely exposed to the air. The basic form was consistent across thousands of years. A curved upper section, called the crest, provided the actual contact point for the head. This crest was supported by a vertical pillar, which rested on a flat rectangular base. The entire object was usually carved from a single piece of wood, though some were made from clay, stone, or even ivory. The woods most commonly used were local species: acacia, sycamore, tamarisk. These woods were hard enough to be durable but soft enough to be carved with bronze or copper tools. The carving process required skill, as the proportions had to be exact for the headrest to function properly. The height of the pillar was critical. It had to be tall enough to bridge the gap between the sleeping surface and the head when the person was lying on their side. If the pillar was too short, the head would not be properly supported and the neck would bend uncomfortably. If it was too tall, the head would be tilted at an awkward angle. The width and curve of the crest were equally important. The crest had to be wide enough to provide stable support, but curved enough to fit the natural contour of the head. Most headrests had a crest that curved in 2 dimensions, both along its length and across its width, creating a saddle-like shape. When used correctly, the headrest supported the head just above the ear when the sleeper was lying on their side, or at the base of the skull when lying on their back. The head rested on the crest, but the neck was not in contact with any part of the headrest. This left the entire neck area open to the air. The primary benefit of this design, in the Egyptian climate, was thermal. By elevating the head and leaving the neck exposed, the headrest allowed air to circulate continuously around the head, neck, and face. This prevented the accumulation of heat and moisture that occurs when the head is buried in a soft pillow. In extreme heat, the body generates warmth, and the head is a significant source of heat loss when allowed to radiate freely. By preventing the head from being insulated, the headrest facilitated this heat loss, helping to keep the sleeper cooler. The headrest also prevented perspiration from accumulating. When the head is pressed into a soft surface, sweat soaks into the material, creating a damp, uncomfortable environment. With the headrest, perspiration evaporated immediately into the moving air, keeping the skin dry. There were secondary benefits as well. The headrest protected elaborate hairstyles. Both men and women in ancient Egypt often wore their hair in complex arrangements, sometimes involving braids, curls, or extensions. Sleeping on a headrest allowed these hairstyles to remain intact overnight, saving the time and effort required to recreate them each morning. Wigs were also common, especially among the wealthy and during formal occasions. A wig was an expensive item, carefully maintained and stored. By sleeping on a headrest, a person could avoid crushing their wig, ensuring it retained its shape and appearance. The headrest also provided a degree of elevation that reduced contact with insects. Scorpions, beetles, and other creatures were common in Egyptian homes, despite efforts to keep them out. By elevating the head several inches above the sleeping surface, the headrest made it less likely that an insect crawling across the floor or mat would come into contact with the face. The hardness of the headrest was initially uncomfortable for anyone not accustomed to it. Modern experiments by archaeologists and Egyptologists have confirmed that sleeping on a wooden headrest requires an adjustment period. The first few nights can be difficult, with soreness in the neck and head. However, those who persist report that the discomfort diminishes after several nights, and the headrest becomes comfortable. Some even report better sleep, with less neck pain and fewer headaches, though these benefits may be individual and related to posture rather than universal. To mitigate the hardness, many Egyptians wrapped the crest of the headrest in layers of linen. This padding provided a softer contact surface, while still maintaining the elevation and airflow that were the primary benefits of the design. Some headrests had small grooves or depressions carved into the crest, designed to hold a resin-based cushion. These cushions were made from a mixture of plant resins and fabric, moulded to fit the curve of the crest. They added a degree of softness without significantly reducing the cooling effect. Archaeological examples of these cushions are rare, as organic materials like resin and fabric degrade over time, but references to them appear in texts and tomb inventories. The headrest was more than a functional object. It carried symbolic and spiritual significance. The curved shape of the crest was deliberately modelled after the hieroglyph for horizon, known as Akhet. This symbol represented the sun rising between two mountains, a daily event that was central to Egyptian cosmology. The sun god, Ra, was believed to die each night as the sun set and to be reborn each morning as it rose. By placing their head on a headrest shaped like the horizon, the sleeper was symbolically aligning themselves with this cycle of death and rebirth. The headrest thus became a talisman, ensuring that the sleeper, like the sun, would rise from the darkness of sleep. This was not merely a poetic metaphor. The Egyptians took the connection seriously, incorporating headrests into their funerary practices. In many tombs, a headrest was placed with the deceased, sometimes positioned under the head of the mummy. This was to ensure that the dead person could rise again in the afterlife, just as they had risen from sleep each morning in life. Spells from the Book of the Dead, a collection of religious texts intended to guide the deceased through the afterlife, specifically mention the headrest. Spell 166, for example, is titled Spell for a Headrest, and is intended to prevent the head from being taken from the deceased in the afterlife, a catastrophic fate that would prevent rebirth. Headrests used in daily life were often decorated with protective deities. The most common of these was Bez, a dwarf god with leonine features, shown frontally rather than in profile like most Egyptian gods. Bes was believed to protect against nightmares, evil spirits, and other dangers of the night. His grotesque appearance, large head, protruding tongue, sometimes wearing a lion's mane, was thought to frighten away malevolent entities. A headrest decorated with the image of Bez provided spiritual protection to the sleeper, ensuring peaceful, undisturbed rest. Another common protective figure was Taweret, depicted as a bipedal hippopotamus, often shown pregnant. Taweret was a goddess of childbirth and motherhood, but she also served as a general protector against harm. Her presence on a headrest indicated that the sleeper was under divine guardianship. Some headrests were inscribed with the name of the owner, sometimes accompanied by titles or epithets. These inscriptions transformed the headrest into a personal object, associated with a specific individual. In tombs, such inscriptions help to identify the deceased and affirm their identity in the afterlife. The headrest thus functioned on multiple levels. It was a practical tool for managing heat and maintaining hairstyles. It was a symbolic object, connecting the sleeper to cosmic cycles. It was a protective amulet, guarding against spiritual dangers, and it was a personal possession, carrying the identity and status of its owner. The use of the headrest was not limited to nighttime sleep. During the midday siesta, when families retreated to the coolest interior rooms, headrests were used as well. The same principles applied: elevation of the head, airflow around the neck, cooling effect. Headrests were portable. They could be carried from room to room or from the interior to the rooftop as needed. Their relatively small size and light weight made them easy to transport, even for children. Wealthy individuals might own several headrests, each one suited to different situations. A simple wooden headrest for everyday use, an elaborately carved and decorated headrest for special occasions or for display, a small portable headrest for travel. For the poor, a single headrest might serve for an entire lifetime passed down from parent to child. These well-used headrests show signs of wear, smooth spots where the head rested, scratches and dents from years of use. They were valued possessions, essential to daily comfort. The headrest exemplifies the Egyptian approach to living in extreme heat. It was not about luxury or extravagance. It was about understanding the specific needs of the body in a specific climate and designing a simple, effective solution. The headrest worked because it addressed the fundamental problem: heat accumulation around the head during sleep. By solving this problem with a design that was inexpensive to produce, easy to use, and culturally meaningful, the Egyptians created an object that endured for millennia. The dual nature of the headrest, simultaneously practical and symbolic, was not unusual in Egyptian culture. Many objects served multiple functions, operating in both the material and spiritual realms. This integration of the sacred and the everyday was a defining characteristic of how Egyptians understood their world. The headrest's symbolic dimension extended beyond its shape. The very act of placing one's head on an object associated with the horizon and the sun's rebirth was a form of participation in the cosmic order. Sleep itself was understood not merely as a physical necessity, but as a temporary death from which one awakened reborn. This understanding shaped the rituals surrounding sleep. Before lying down, some Egyptians would recite prayers or incantations, asking for protection during the vulnerable hours of the night. These prayers invoked gods like Bez and Taweret, whose images adorned the headrest, creating a complete system of spiritual defense. The materials used to make headrests carried their own significance. Wood, especially from trees that grew near water or in sacred groves, was considered to have protective properties. Acacia wood, in particular, was associated with the goddess Isis and with resurrection, making it a suitable material for an object connected to rebirth. Stone headrests, though less common due to their weight and the difficulty of carving, were sometimes made from materials like alabaster or limestone. These stone headrests were usually reserved for funerary use, placed in tombs where durability mattered more than portability. Ivory headrests carved from hippopotamus tusks were rare and valuable. Ivory was a luxury material, associated with purity and divine power. An ivory headrest would have been owned only by the very wealthy or by royalty, and it would have been as much a status symbol as a functional object. The decoration of headrests varied according to the resources and preferences of the owner. Simple headrests might be unadorned, just the basic form carved from a single piece of wood. More elaborate versions featured carved reliefs, painted designs, or inlaid materials. Common decorative motifs included lotus flowers, symbols of rebirth and purity. The lotus closed at night and opened at dawn, mirroring the sun's daily cycle and reinforcing the connection between sleep and renewal. Other motifs included papyrus plants, ankh symbols representing life, and jid pillars representing stability. Some headrests incorporated small chambers or compartments, designed to hold amulets or protective charms. These chambers might contain small figures of gods, inscribed papyrus, or other objects believed to ward off harm. The headrest thus became a portable shrine, bringing divine protection wherever the sleeper rested. The psychological comfort provided by these symbolic elements should not be dismissed. In a world without electric lights, without locked doors, without many of the security measures we take for granted, the night was genuinely threatening. Wild animals, human intruders, and malevolent spirits were all perceived as real dangers. The headrest, with its protective deities and sacred associations, provided reassurance. It was a tangible reminder that the sleeper was not alone, that divine forces were watching over them. This sense of protection may have been as important to restful sleep as the physical cooling the headrest provided. The use of headrests was taught from childhood. Young children learned to sleep on small child-sized headrests, gradually adjusting to the sensation. This early training meant that by adulthood, sleeping on a headrest felt natural, comfortable, even necessary. This cultural transmission was important. The headrest was not an innovation that each generation had to rediscover. It was an established part of daily life, as familiar as sandals or linen clothing. Everyone knew how to use one, everyone owned one, and everyone understood its importance. In artistic representations, headrests appear, frequently. Tomb paintings show servants arranging headrests for their masters. Statues depict individuals reclining with their heads supported by headrests. These images confirm that the headrest was a universal element of Egyptian sleep culture, crossing all social classes. The positioning of the headrest on the sleeping surface was also significant. It was placed at the head of the mat or bed, oriented so that the sleeper faced north or northwest. This orientation aligned the sleeper with the direction of the cool breeze, and with certain cosmological principles. The north was associated with the stars that never set, the circumpolar constellations that rotated around the North Star but never dropped below the horizon. These imperishable stars were believed to be the realm of the blessed dead, eternally alive in the sky. By sleeping with the head to the north, the sleeper symbolically aligned themselves with these eternal stars, participating in the immortality they represented. This alignment was considered auspicious, promoting not just physical rest but spiritual well-being. The care taken in positioning the headrest, in choosing its materials, in decorating it with protective symbols, all reflect the Egyptian understanding that sleep was not a passive state, but an active engagement with cosmic forces. The headrest was the tool that facilitated this engagement, bridging the physical need for cooling with the spiritual need for protection and renewal. As the night deepened and the sleeper settled onto the headrest, the combination of elevation, airflow, and symbolic protection created an environment conducive to rest. The head, supported and cooled, could release the day's accumulated heat. The mind, reassured by the presence of protective deities, could relax into sleep. The headrest remained in use throughout the night, maintaining its function even as the sleeper shifted positions. The curved crest accommodated different sleeping postures: side, back, even partially prone. The elevation remained constant, ensuring that the neck and head stayed cool. In the morning, as the stars faded and the first light appeared on the eastern horizon, the sleeper would rise, lifting their head from the headrest. This act of rising mirrored the sun's emergence, completing the cycle of symbolic death and rebirth. The headrest, having served its purpose through the night, would be set aside, ready to be used again when evening returned. It was a simple object, but it carried layers of meaning, practical, symbolic, spiritual, all integrated into a coherent whole. Linen was as essential to Egyptian life as mudbrick or water. It was the primary textile used for clothing, bedding, sails, bandages, and countless other purposes. Its dominance was not accidental. Linen possessed specific properties that made it superior to other available fabrics for the Egyptian climate. The source of linen was the flax plant, known scientifically as Linum justicissimum. This plant thrived in the conditions of the Nile Valley. It was one of the first crops planted after the annual flood receded, growing quickly in the fertile, saturated soil. Flax cultivation followed a precise calendar. The seeds were sown in late autumn, after the floodwaters had withdrawn but while the soil was still moist. The plants grew through the winter, a season of mild temperatures and occasional rain. By early spring, the flax was ready to harvest. The timing of the harvest was critical. Flax had to be pulled from the ground before the seeds fully matured, but after the stems had reached their maximum length. This ensured that the fibres within the stems were long and strong, ideal for spinning into thread. Harvesting was done by hand. Workers grasped bundles of flax stems near the base and pulled them up, roots and all. The plants were then bundled and laid out to dry in the sun. This initial drying prepared the flax for the next stage of processing. The process of transforming flax stems into linen thread was labour-intensive and required multiple steps. The first was retting, soaking the dried stems in water to loosen the fibres from the woody core. This could be done in the Nile, in canals, or in special retting ponds. Retting took several days. During this time, bacteria broke down the pectin that bound the fibres to the stem. The water turned dark and developed a strong odour, but this was a necessary part of the process. When the fibres could be easily separated from the stem, the retting was complete. After retting, the flax was dried again, then beaten to break up the woody core. This beating was done with wooden mallets or special tools, crushing the stem without damaging the fibres. The broken woody pieces, called shivs, were then removed by scutching, scraping the fibres with a blunt blade to separate them from the debris. The next step was hackling, or combing. The fibres were pulled through a series of increasingly fine combs, aligning them and removing any remaining impurities. This process produced long, parallel fibres ready for spinning. Spinning transformed the loose fibres into continuous thread. This was done using a spindle, a weighted stick that was rotated to twist the fibres together. The spinner would draw out fibres from a bundle, attach them to the spindle and set it spinning. As it spun, the fibres twisted into a strong, even thread. Spinning required skill and practice. The tension had to be consistent, the twist had to be uniform, and the thickness of the thread had to be controlled. Egyptian spinners were highly proficient, capable of producing threads of varying weights, from coarse and heavy to fine and almost invisible. The finest linen, known as royal linen or byssus, was so sheer that it was nearly transparent. This fabric was reserved for the elite, used for clothing, temple furnishings, and mummy wrappings for the wealthy. It required the longest, finest flax fibres and the most skilled spinners. Ordinary linen, used by the general population, was coarser but still of high quality. It was durable, able to withstand repeated washing and wear. It was also versatile, suitable for everything from heavy work clothes to lightweight bed sheets. The weaving of linen thread into fabric was done on looms. In ancient Egypt, the most common type was the horizontal ground loom, consisting of 2 beams staked to the ground with the warp thread stretched between them. The weaver sat or knelt at one end, passing the weft thread over and under the warp threads to create the fabric. Later, vertical looms became more common, especially for producing larger or more complex textiles. These looms allowed for greater control and made it easier to create intricate patterns or vary the density of the weave. The fabric produced could be plain weave, the simplest form, or more complex weaves like twill. The thread count, the number of threads per inch, varied depending on the quality of the linen. Fine linen had a high thread count, creating a smooth, soft fabric. Coarse linen had a lower thread count, resulting in a rougher, more durable material. Linen's superiority in hot climates stems from its molecular structure. The flax fibre is made of cellulose, a polymer that is highly absorbent. Linen can absorb up to 20% of its weight in moisture before it begins to feel damp to the touch. This absorption capacity is crucial in hot, dry climates. When a person sweats, the moisture is wickered away from the skin into the linen fabric. There, it spreads across a larger surface area, where it can evaporate more quickly. This evaporation cools both the fabric and, by extension, the skin beneath it. Linen also has high thermal conductivity compared to other natural fibres like wool or cotton. This means it does not trap heat. Instead, it allows heat to pass through, releasing it into the surrounding air. This property makes linen feel cool to the touch, even when the ambient temperature is high. The texture of linen contributes to its cooling effect as well. Linen fabric, especially when loosely woven, has a slightly rough surface. This texture creates small air pockets between the fabric and the skin, allowing for greater air circulation and reducing direct contact. These properties made linen ideal for bedding in the Egyptian climate. Linen sheets were light, breathable, and capable of managing the moisture that accumulated during sleep. They dried quickly, even in humid conditions near the river. Linen was also easy to clean. It could be washed repeatedly without degrading, and it actually became softer with each washing as the fibres relaxed. Egyptian laundry techniques involved soaking the linen in the Nile or in basins, then beating it on stones to remove dirt. Natron, a naturally occurring salt, was sometimes used as a mild detergent. The colour of linen varied depending on the quality of the flax and the processing methods. Most linen was a natural off-white or pale beige. Fine linen, carefully processed, could be almost white. Coarser linen retained more of the natural colour of the flax, appearing more tan or grey. Linen could be dyed, though this was less common for bedding than for clothing. Dyes derived from plants, minerals or insects could produce a range of colours: reds, yellows, blues. However, dyeing was expensive and usually reserved for decorative or ceremonial textiles. For bedding, undyed linen was preferred. The natural colour reflected light rather than absorbing it, contributing to the cooling effect. Dyed fabrics, especially those in dark colours, would have absorbed more heat, making them less suitable for sleeping in extreme temperatures. The production of linen was a major industry in ancient Egypt. It employed thousands of people: farmers growing flax, workers processing the stems, spinners creating thread, weavers making fabric. The industry was organised and regulated, with quality standards enforced by temple and state authorities. Linen was also a form of currency. It could be traded for other goods, used to pay taxes, or given as gifts. The value of linen depended on its quality. Fine linen was worth far more than coarse linen. A single piece of high-quality linen could represent weeks or months of labour. The importance of linen extended into the afterlife. Mummies were wrapped in linen bandages, sometimes requiring hundreds of metres of fabric. These wrappings were not merely practical, they were symbolic, representing purity and transformation. The deceased was wrapped in linen just as a newborn was swaddled, emphasising the theme of rebirth. For the living, linen bedding was a nightly necessity. Sheets were spread over sleeping mats or bed frames, providing a clean, cool surface to lie on. Lightweight linen blankets were available for the cooler hours of the night, though they were used sparingly during the hottest months. The feel of linen against the skin became associated with comfort and cleanliness. Fresh linen, recently washed and dried in the sun, carried the scent of the outdoors. It was smooth, cool, and inviting, a sensory signal that rest was at hand. The most effective technique for nocturnal cooling combined linen's moisture-wicking properties with the principle of evaporative cooling. This method, known in various forms throughout history, was particularly well suited to the dry desert climate of Egypt. The technique was straightforward. A large linen sheet was dampened with water, then wrung out until it was moist but not dripping. This damp sheet was then used as a covering for the sleeper, placed directly over the body or over a dry sheet that had been laid on the sleeping surface. As the sleeper lay beneath the damp linen, the moving air, whether from the malkaf, from the rooftop breeze, or from the natural convection within the room, passed over the fabric. The moisture in the linen began to evaporate. Evaporation is an endothermic process, meaning it absorbs energy from its surroundings. As water molecules transition from liquid to gas, they draw heat from the fabric, from the air, and from the body of the sleeper. This heat absorption creates a cooling effect. The magnitude of this cooling depends on several factors. The drier the air, the faster the evaporation, and the greater the cooling effect. In the Nile Valley, where humidity was often below 20%, evaporation occurred rapidly. The amount of airflow also mattered. Gentle, continuous movement of air over the damp fabric removed the water vapour as it formed, preventing the air immediately around the fabric from becoming saturated. This maintained the evaporation rate and sustained the cooling effect. The quality of the linen influenced the effectiveness as well. Finer linen, with a tighter weave, held moisture more evenly and released it more gradually. Coarser linen absorbed more water initially but released it more quickly, providing intense but shorter-lived cooling. The temperature reduction achieved by this method could be substantial. On a night when the ambient temperature was still in the 90s Fahrenheit, a damp linen sheet could lower the perceived temperature for the sleeper by 10 or even 15 degrees. This difference transformed an uncomfortably hot night into a tolerable one. The technique required some judgment. If the sheet was too wet, it would feel clammy and uncomfortable, and the sleeper might become chilled as evaporation proceeded. If it was too dry, the cooling effect would be minimal and short-lived. The ideal moisture level was achieved through experience. A practiced individual could wring out the sheet to precisely the right dampness, ensuring maximum comfort and cooling throughout the night. The damp sheet technique was particularly valuable during the hottest months, from late spring through early autumn, when nighttime temperatures remained uncomfortably high, even after the sun had set. During these months, the rooftop, despite its exposure to the breeze and the night sky, could still be too warm for comfortable sleep without additional cooling. The process of preparing the damp sheet became part of the evening routine. Water was drawn from the Nile, from a well, or from a large storage jar. The sheet was submerged, allowing it to absorb water fully. Then it was lifted and wrung out, twisted and squeezed until most of the water had been removed. This wringing was often a two-person task, with one person holding each end of the sheet and twisting in opposite directions. The physical effort involved was not insignificant, but it was a small price for the comfort that followed. Once prepared, the damp sheet was carried to the rooftop or to the sleeping area within the house. It was spread over the dry sheet on the sleeping surface, or sometimes directly over the body of the sleeper. As the night progressed, the sheet would gradually dry. The rate of drying depended on the temperature, humidity, and wind. On a particularly dry, breezy night, the sheet might be completely dry within a few hours. On a more humid, still night, it might remain damp until dawn. If the sheet dried too quickly, it could be redampened. A small jar of water kept near the sleeping area allowed for this without requiring a trip back down to the ground level. The sleeper, or a family member, could sprinkle water over the sheet, restoring its cooling effect. The damp sheet technique had an additional benefit beyond cooling. The moisture in the fabric helped to maintain the humidity of the air immediately around the sleeper's body, preventing the skin and respiratory passages from becoming too dry. In the extremely low humidity of the desert, the mucous membranes of the nose and throat could become irritated and uncomfortable. Breathing air that had passed over the damp linen provided some moisture, reducing this irritation and making sleep more comfortable. The psychological effect of the damp sheet should not be overlooked. The sensation of coolness against the skin, even if modest, provided a sense of relief and comfort. It signalled that measures had been taken against the heat, that the night would be bearable. This sense of control over the environment, of actively managing the heat rather than passively enduring it, may have contributed to a more relaxed state of mind, making it easier to fall asleep. The damp sheet technique was not unique to Egypt. Similar methods have been documented in other hot, arid regions: the Middle East, parts of India, the American Southwest. The technique has various names, but the principle is always the same. Wet fabric plus dry air equals cooling through evaporation. In Egypt, the technique persisted for thousands of years, passed down through generations as part of the practical knowledge necessary for survival in the desert. It required no special tools, no expensive materials, just water, linen, and an understanding of how evaporation works. The effectiveness of the technique demonstrated the Egyptian principle of working with natural processes rather than against them. The heat was not fought directly. Instead, the properties of water, air, and fabric were harnessed to create a cooling effect that made the heat manageable. The damp sheet was often combined with other cooling strategies. A sleeper on a rooftop positioned to catch the northwest breeze, lying on a raised bed that allowed air circulation beneath the body, with their head elevated on a headrest and covered with a damp linen sheet, experienced multiple layers of cooling working simultaneously. Each layer contributed to the overall effect. The breeze provided airflow. The bed frame prevented heat accumulation beneath the body. The headrest kept the head cool. The damp sheet provided evaporative cooling directly to the torso and limbs. Together, these strategies created an environment where sleep was possible even when the thermometer suggested it should not be. The Egyptians did not have the luxury of lowering the air temperature mechanically, but they understood how to lower the perceived temperature through intelligent design and simple techniques. As the night deepened and the damp sheet gradually dried, the cooling effect diminished, but by that time the ambient temperature had usually dropped significantly. The worst of the evening heat had passed. The deep night, when the desert released its accumulated warmth to the clear sky, brought natural cooling that supplemented the artificial methods. By dawn, the sheet was usually dry, and the temperature was at its lowest point. The sleeper might then pull a dry blanket over themselves, seeking warmth rather than coolness. The night had brought relief, and the cycle would begin again with the rising sun. The design of Egyptian sleeping furniture reflected the same understanding of airflow and heat management that shaped their architecture. Unlike the thick padded mattresses that would later become common in cooler climates, Egyptian beds were engineered to prevent the accumulation of heat between the sleeper and the sleeping surface. The standard bed frame was a rectangular structure, typically measuring about 6 feet in length and 3 feet in width. These dimensions accommodated a single sleeper comfortably, though wider versions existed for couples. The frame was constructed from wood, sycamore, acacia, or tamarisk, depending on availability and the wealth of the owner. The most distinctive feature of the Egyptian bed was its sleeping surface. Rather than a solid platform or a thick mattress, the surface consisted of a network of cords woven across the frame. These cords were made from linen, the same material used for clothing and sheets, or from thin strips of leather. The weaving pattern created a tensioned surface stretched tight across the frame. The cords were interlaced in a crisscross pattern, sometimes simple, sometimes more complex, creating a flexible but supportive platform. The tension was critical, too loose, and the surface would sag uncomfortably, too tight, and it would be rigid and uncomfortable. This woven surface provided several advantages. First, it was breathable. Air could pass freely through the gaps between the cords, preventing heat from being trapped beneath the sleeper's body. When a person lay on a solid surface, their body heat had nowhere to go. It accumulated between the body and the surface, creating a warm, uncomfortable zone. On a woven surface, this heat could dissipate continuously. Air circulated beneath the body, carrying away warmth and preventing the build-up that would otherwise make sleep difficult. This constant circulation was passive, requiring no effort from the sleeper, but its effect was substantial. The woven surface also conformed slightly to the body's shape, distributing weight more evenly than a hard, flat surface would. This reduced pressure points, making the bed more comfortable despite the lack of thick padding. The slight give of the cords allowed the body to settle into a natural position. The elevation of the bed frame was another critical element. Egyptian beds typically stood between 1 and 3 feet off the ground, supported by 4 legs attached to the corners of the frame. This elevation served multiple purposes. First, it placed the sleeper in the path of moving air. Breezes entering through the malkaf or through open windows tended to flow at a level above the floor. By elevating the bed, the sleeper positioned themselves where the air movement was strongest. Second, the elevation created space beneath the bed for air to circulate. This prevented the floor, which might still be radiating stored heat from the day, from warming the underside of the sleeping surface. The gap allowed heat to dissipate downward and away rather than being trapped. Third, the elevation provided some protection from creatures that moved along the floor. Snakes, scorpions, and insects were less likely to climb onto a raised bed than to encounter a sleeper lying directly on the ground. This was not absolute protection, but it reduced the risk. The legs of the bed were often carved to resemble animal feet. Lion paws were particularly common, but bull hooves and other forms also appeared. These carvings were not merely decorative. They carried symbolic significance, associating the bed with strength, protection, and power. Lion imagery in particular was connected to solar deities and to royalty. The lion was a symbol of fierce protection, and its presence on the bed suggested that the sleeper was guarded, safe from harm. This symbolic protection complemented the physical protection provided by the bed's elevation. The legs were sometimes reinforced with horizontal stretchers, wooden bars connecting the legs to add stability. These stretchers prevented the legs from spreading apart under weight and made the bed more durable. A well-constructed bed could last for decades, even generations. In wealthier households, beds might be elaborately decorated. The frame could be inlaid with ivory, ebony, or precious metals. The headboard, a vertical panel at one end of the bed, might be carved with religious scenes, protective deities, or the owner's name and titles. These decorative elements did not compromise the bed's functional properties. The woven sleeping surface and the elevated frame remained the same, regardless of how ornate the decoration. The core design was consistent across social classes because it worked. For those who could not afford a wooden bed frame, alternatives existed. Thick woven mats made from reeds or palm fibres could be placed directly on the floor. These mats were less effective than raised beds. They did not provide the same airflow or elevation, but they were better than sleeping on bare earth. Some families constructed simple platforms from mud brick, raising the sleeping surface a few inches off the ground. These platforms were then covered with mats, creating a compromise between the fully raised bed and the floor mat. The platforms provided some elevation and some air circulation, though not as much as a proper bed frame. The portability of bed frames varied. Simple frames could be disassembled, with the legs removed and the woven surface rolled up. This made it possible to move the bed from one location to another, from an interior room to the rooftop, for example, without great difficulty. More elaborate beds were permanent fixtures, too heavy or too complex to move easily. These remained in place year-round, though the bedding and headrests used with them would still migrate to the rooftop during the hottest months. The process of stringing a bed, weaving the cord or leather across the frame, required skill. The material had to be the right thickness and strength. The tension had to be even across the entire surface. The weaving pattern had to be tight enough to support weight, but open enough to allow airflow. Bed makers learned this skill through apprenticeship, observing experienced craftsmen and practicing until they could produce a properly tensioned surface. The work required patience and precision, but the result was a sleeping surface that could endure years of use. Over time, the cords would stretch or wear. When this happened, the bed could be restrung, replacing the old cords with new ones. This maintenance kept the bed functional indefinitely, as long as the wooden frame remained sound. The The combination of woven surface and elevated frame created a sleeping platform that was fundamentally different from modern beds. It did not insulate, it did not cushion heavily. Instead, it facilitated the movement of air and the dissipation of heat, creating conditions where sleep in extreme temperatures became possible. When combined with the other elements of the Egyptian sleep system, the cool mud brick rooms, the rooftop exposure, the headrest, the linen sheets, the bed became part of an integrated approach to managing heat. Each element supported the others, creating a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. The Egyptian bed was not designed for softness or luxury in the modern sense. It was designed for survival, for maintaining health and rest in a climate that actively resisted both. It succeeded because it understood the fundamental problem, heat accumulation, and addressed it directly through design. The extreme heat of the Egyptian day made continuous wakefulness from dawn to dusk physically impossible. The human body, subjected to temperatures above 100 degrees for hours at a time, required rest to prevent heat exhaustion and maintain basic function. The Egyptians adapted to this reality by dividing their day into distinct periods of activity and rest. This pattern, known in sleep research as biphasic or polyphasic sleep, was not a cultural preference but a biological necessity. The day typically began at dawn, when the temperature was at its lowest. This was the coolest, most comfortable time for physical labour. Farmers went to their fields, artisans opened their workshops, and builders began their work. The early morning hours, from sunrise until mid-morning, were a period of high activity. As the sun climbed higher and the temperature rose, the pace of work gradually slowed. By late morning, when the heat was becoming oppressive, most outdoor activities ceased. Workers returned to their homes or sought shelter in shaded areas. The period from noon until approximately 3 in the afternoon was devoted to rest. This midday siesta was not optional, it was essential for survival. During these hours, the sun was at its zenith, the temperature at its peak, and the risk of heat-related illness at its highest. Families retreated to the coolest, deepest rooms of their mud brick homes. The interior chambers surrounded by thick walls that had not yet absorbed the full heat of the day. Here, in relative darkness and coolness, they rested. This rest was not always deep sleep. Sometimes it was simply lying still, conserving energy, allowing the body to cool. The reduction in physical activity lowered the metabolic rate, reducing the amount of heat the body generated internally. For some, particularly those who'd been engaged in heavy physical labour, the siesta provided an opportunity for genuine sleep. The body, exhausted from the morning's work and stressed by the heat, welcomed the chance to recuperate. The rooms used for the siesta were prepared to maximise coolness. Windows and doors might be closed to prevent hot outside air from entering, or they might be partially open to allow a through breeze, depending on the specific conditions of the day. Wet mats might be hung over openings, providing evaporative cooling as air passed through. The floor, still cool from the night, provided a surface that absorbed rather than radiated heat. People would lie on mats spread on this floor, sometimes sprinkling water on the ground to enhance the cooling effect. As the afternoon progressed and the sun began its descent, the temperature gradually decreased. By late afternoon, usually around 3 or 4 o'clock, it became possible to resume activity. This second period of work lasted from late afternoon until sunset. The light was still good, the temperature more bearable than it had been at midday. This was the time for lighter tasks, household chores, food preparation, social activities. After sunset, as darkness fell and the temperature continued to drop, families gathered for the evening meal. This meal was often the main social event of the day, a time for conversation, for sharing news, for strengthening family bonds. Following the meal, there was a period of wakefulness. People did not immediately go to sleep after eating. Instead, they engaged in various activities, repairing tools, weaving, telling, stories, or simply sitting together in the cooling evening air. This evening period of wakefulness was important. It allowed the body to digest the meal before lying down. It also allowed the interior of the house to cool, as the walls released their stored heat and the malkaf brought in fresh air. By the time full darkness had arrived, perhaps 2 or 3 hours after sunset, families were ready for the first period of sleep. they would move to their sleeping locations, whether the rooftop or an interior room, and settle down for the night. This first sleep lasted approximately 4 to 6 hours. During this time, the body temperature dropped to its lowest point, and the deepest, most restorative sleep occurred. This was the sleep that truly mattered for physical and mental recovery. But this first sleep did not last until dawn. Around midnight or in the early morning hours, many people would wake. This waking was natural, not the result of disturbance or discomfort. It was part of the sleep pattern that had evolved in response to the climate and lifestyle. During this middle-of-the-night wakefulness, various activities might occur. Some people prayed or performed simple rituals. Others engaged in quiet conversation with family members who had also awakened. Some attended to bodily needs, drinking water, adjusting bedding, checking on children. This period was also a time for contemplation. In the silence of the deep night, under the vast expanse of stars, there was space for thought, for reflection on the events of the day or concerns about the future. The duration of this wakeful period varied. It might be as brief as half an hour or as long as 2 hours. There was no urgency to return to sleep immediately. The night was long, and there was time. Eventually, as the body cooled further or as the mind exhausted its thoughts, a second sleep would begin. This second sleep lasted until the pre-dawn hours, when the sky began to lighten and the stars faded. This second sleep was often lighter than the first, closer to the surface of consciousness. Dreams were more common during this period, and the sleeper was more easily awakened by sounds or changes in temperature. As dawn approached, the temperature would drop to its lowest point. This was the coldest part of the night, when even in summer a light blanket might be welcome. The breeze, which had been steady through the evening, often diminished in the pre-dawn hours, creating a still, quiet atmosphere. People would wake naturally as the light increased and the temperature began to rise. There were no alarm clocks, no artificial signals. The body, attuned to the rhythm of the sun, knew when it was time to stir. This biphasic sleep pattern, a midday rest followed by 2 periods of nighttime sleep separated by wakefulness, was ideally suited to the Egyptian climate and lifestyle. It distributed rest across the entire 24-hour cycle, preventing the accumulation of fatigue or heat stress. It also aligned human activity with the natural rhythm of temperature variation. People were active when the temperature was moderate, at rest when it was extreme. They worked in the cool of the morning and evening, rested during the heat of the day and the chill of the deep night. This pattern was not unique to Egypt. Similar sleep patterns have been documented in other pre-industrial societies and in historical records from various cultures. Before the advent of artificial lighting and industrial work schedules, segmented sleep appears to have been common, perhaps even the norm. The middle-of-the-night wakefulness, in particular, was not seen as insomnia or as a problem to be solved. It was simply part of the natural rhythm of the night, a time for activities that required quiet and solitude. This acceptance of variable sleep patterns stood in contrast to modern expectations of continuous, uninterrupted sleep. The Egyptians did not expect to sleep for 8 hours straight. They expected to sleep when their bodies needed rest, and to wake when they did not. This flexibility reduced anxiety about sleep itself. There was no pressure to fall asleep immediately or to remain asleep for a prescribed duration. Sleep came when it came, and wakefulness was accepted without concern. The biphasic pattern also had practical advantages. It meant that someone was often awake during the night, able to respond to emergencies, a crying child, an animal in distress, an intruder, or a fire. This distributed wakefulness provided a form of collective vigilance. In the context of extreme heat, the segmented sleep pattern allowed the body to rest during the most stressful periods, while remaining active during the more tolerable hours. It was an adaptation that made life in the desert not just survivable, but sustainable across generations.